It was a warm Sunday afternoon in a small town in Georgia. The streets were quiet and most people had already gone home after church. The little convenience store on the corner of Maple Street was one of the few places still open. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and floor cleaner. The store clerk, a young man who had just started working there, was ringing up customers while an old gospel song played softly from a radio behind the counter. At around 2 o'clock, a woman named Martha Ellis walked in. She was 67, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in that town most of her life. People knew her for her gentle smile and the way she always greeted strangers like old friends. She wore a soft blue dress and carried a small brown purse. Her knees hurt most days, but she never let it show. That afternoon, she only wanted a carton of milk and a newspaper. When Martha stepped inside, she noticed 2 young men standing near the counter arguing with the cashier. It didn't look serious at first, just loud talk, the kind of thing that happened when tempers ran high and patience ran low. One of them was saying the price had been rung up wrong, while the clerk was trying to explain it was just a tax issue. Martha stood by the refrigerator aisle for a moment, hoping things would calm down before she approached the counter. She hated seeing people fight. She'd spent years teaching kids to talk through problems, not shout through them. Outside, a police car pulled into the parking lot. Someone must have called about the noise. The officer inside, Daniel Reeves, had been on the force for several years. People in town knew him as strict, sometimes a little too quick to show authority. He was the kind of man who liked control, of his words, of his space, of the people around him. When Reeves entered the store, his boots thumped hard against the floor. The bell above the door jingled, but nobody smiled. The tension in the room thickened instantly. He looked around and asked in a sharp tone what was going on. The young men turned toward him, both speaking at once, trying to explain their side. The clerk looked nervous. Martha watched quietly from a few steps away. She thought about leaving, but her sense of right and wrong held her there. She had always believed that staying silent when you could help was the same as agreeing with the wrong thing. Reeves began raising his voice, telling the young men to step back, that they were causing a scene. One of them tried to explain again, saying it was all just a misunderstanding. But Reeves wasn't listening. His hand was near his belt, and his body language said he was ready to show authority if he had to. That's when Martha took a slow step forward. Her voice was soft and calm, the same tone she used with her students years ago when they were upset. She said, "Officer, please, let's just talk it out. They're not trying to cause trouble." Her words weren't loud, but everyone heard them. Reeves turned his head sharply, his eyes narrowing like he'd been challenged. He didn't recognize her. To him, she was just another bystander getting in the way. "Ma'am, stay back," he said firmly. "This is police business." Martha stopped but didn't back away completely. She looked at the 2 young men, one of them couldn't have been more than 20, and then back at Reeves. "You don't need to yell," she said softly. "It's just a misunderstanding." For a moment, silence filled the room. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. The tension in the air felt heavy, like a thunderstorm about to break. Reeves took a step closer, his voice rising again. "Ma'am, I said back up." Martha lifted her hands slightly, palms open, a small sign of peace. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'm just saying they're not—" The clerk's phone started ringing behind the counter, and the sudden sound startled everyone. Reeves jerked slightly, his nerves on edge. The young men stepped back quickly, hands raised, but Martha's small movement, just turning her shoulder as she tried to move aside, was misread. Reeves reached out fast, shouting for her to stop. Before anyone could react, Martha stumbled backward. She lost her balance and fell hard against the side of the counter. The sound of the fall echoed through the store, followed by a collective gasp. The milk she'd been holding slipped from her hand, spilling across the floor. Everything froze for a few seconds. The 2 young men stood still, their eyes wide. The clerk rushed around the counter, kneeling beside her. Martha didn't move. Her head rested awkwardly against the floor tiles, her purse still clutched in her hand. Reeves took a step back, his chest rising and falling quickly. His face turned pale. He hadn't meant for it to happen like that, but it had. For a moment, nobody said a word. The only sound was the radio in the background, still playing that old gospel song, faint and haunting. Then someone shouted, "Call an ambulance!" The clerk fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking. One of the young men crouched down, speaking softly to Martha, but she didn't answer. Her eyes were closed, her breathing faint. A thin line of concern crossed every face in that room. Reeves reached for his radio and called it in, his voice uneven. He tried to sound official, tried to sound calm, but there was a tremor in his words. "We have a medical emergency," he said. "Female, possibly unconscious." He didn't mention what caused it. Minutes later, the sound of sirens filled the air. A small crowd began to gather outside, drawn by the noise. The paramedics rushed in with a stretcher, checking Martha's pulse and lifting her gently. One of them asked what happened. Reeves started to speak but hesitated, his words coming out uncertain and broken. The clerk looked at him, then at the paramedics, then said quietly, "She fell." Nobody corrected him. Not yet. The truth hung heavy in the air, too heavy for anyone to touch. As the paramedics wheeled Martha out, her gray hair brushed against the stretcher's edge. Someone from the crowd outside whispered, "That's Miss Ellis," and murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Everyone in that neighborhood knew her. She had taught half of their children, tutored kids after school for free, and always brought food to church picnics. Seeing her like that broke something in them. Reeves followed the stretcher out, his stomach twisting. The flashing red and blue lights painted his face in harsh colors. He tried to convince himself it was an accident, that she'd just lost her balance. But deep down he knew that wasn't true. He'd acted too fast. Again. The paramedics loaded Martha into the ambulance and the doors shut with a dull thud. As the vehicle pulled away, Reeves stood there, watching the lights fade down the street. The young men were still inside the store, one of them shaking his head slowly. The clerk looked pale, holding onto the counter for support. An older man from the crowd stepped forward and said quietly, "Officer, you better hope she's okay." Reeves didn't answer. He just nodded slightly and turned away. His hands were trembling. The reality of what just happened began to sink in, piece by piece. He walked back to his patrol car, sat inside, and stared through the windshield. The world outside looked blurry. He radioed in again, saying he'd be writing a report, but the words felt meaningless. How do you put something like that into a report? Elderly woman interfered with police procedure. Accidental contact. Subject fell. Those were the kind of words the department liked. Safe, distant, clean. But he couldn't stop seeing the look on her face right before she fell. Not fear, not anger, just disappointment. Back at the store, people were still talking. Someone had filmed part of what happened on their phone. The shaky footage showed a few seconds of chaos, Reeves shouting, Martha stepping forward, and then the fall. Nobody knew how quickly that video would spread, but for now it stayed in the hands of a young bystander who wasn't sure what to do with it yet. At the hospital, Martha was rushed into the emergency room. The doctors worked quickly, checking her head, her breathing, her pulse. The nurse found her ID card and made a note of her name. She was stable but unconscious. The doctor said she needed to be monitored closely. They called the emergency contact listed on her form, a neighbor who had known her for years. By evening, the news had already begun to reach the town. People whispered about what happened at the store, each version of the story slightly different but all carrying the same shock. Some said the officer pushed her, others said she just fell. Nobody really knew yet, but everyone felt uneasy. Reeves sat alone in his patrol car long after his shift ended. The sun had set, and the town was quiet again. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to calm the pounding in his chest. His thoughts raced. Would she be okay? Would there be an investigation? Would anyone believe it was just an accident? He turned off his body camera before entering the store earlier, thinking it was just a minor disturbance call. Now that decision haunted him. Without that footage, his report would be the only official record, unless the cell phone video surfaced. He rubbed his face with his hands, exhausted. In his mind, he replayed the moment again and again, wishing he could take it back, wishing he'd just listened for once instead of reacting. But the past doesn't rewind for anyone. As the night grew darker, a single streetlight flickered outside the station, casting long shadows across the pavement. Somewhere in a hospital room, Martha lay still, her heartbeat steady but faint. Her small purse sat on a table beside her bed, her glasses folded neatly on top. On the nightstand was her church bulletin, with her favorite verse highlighted, "Blessed are the peacemakers." And in the quiet of that night, two lives, one old, one hardened by duty, were about to change forever. The next morning, the little town woke up to uneasy whispers. News of the incident at the corner store had already started spreading. Some people said it was a misunderstanding, others said it was worse than that. But everyone agreed on one thing: something about it didn't feel right. At the hospital, the quiet beep of machines filled the room where Martha lay. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing soft and steady. The nurses checked her often, speaking in low voices. They had seen many patients before, but something about this old woman touched their hearts. Maybe it was the peaceful look on her face or the way her hands rested gently on the blanket, as if she were still praying in her sleep. By noon, a few friends from her church had gathered in the waiting area. They brought flowers and spoke softly among themselves, trying to make sense of what had happened. The neighbor who received the hospital's call the night before had been the first to arrive. She sat quietly, clutching her handbag, tears glistening in her eyes. She was just buying milk, she kept saying. She never hurt anyone. Back at the police station, Officer Reeves sat in a small office, typing up his report. The room felt colder than usual, even though the morning sun shone through the blinds. Every click of the keyboard echoed in his head. He had rewritten the report twice already, changing small details each time. He wanted to make it sound right, sound believable, but the words didn't come easily. He wrote, "The suspect became agitated during questioning." He stopped, stared at the words, then deleted the line. She wasn't a suspect. She wasn't agitated. She was an elderly woman who had tried to calm things down. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His supervisor, Sergeant Miller, walked in holding a cup of coffee. "You all right, Reeves?" he asked casually, like this was just another day. Reeves nodded, though his throat felt tight. "Just writing the report." "Good," Miller said. "Keep it short and clean. We'll handle the rest. We don't need this getting out of hand." Reeves looked up. "She's in the hospital. I heard she hasn't woken up." Miller hesitated for a moment, then shrugged slightly. "Accidents happen. You followed procedure. We'll back you." The words were meant to comfort him, but instead they made him feel worse. Followed procedure. It was what they always said when something went wrong. But deep down, Reeves knew he hadn't followed anything. He'd reacted without thinking. After Miller left, Reeves stared at his reflection in the computer screen. He saw the tired eyes of a man who didn't know what to believe anymore. For years, he'd told himself he was doing good work, keeping people safe, but now he wasn't sure who he was protecting. Later that afternoon, a few officers gathered in the break room, whispering about what had happened. "I heard she fell," one of them said. "He didn't touch her." Another shook his head. "That's not what the clerk said." The room went quiet when Reeves walked in. He could feel their eyes on him, but nobody said a word. He poured himself some coffee, even though his hands trembled slightly, and then left. At the same time, across town, the young man who had filmed the incident sat on his couch, staring at his phone. The video was short and shaky, but it showed enough. You could see Martha stepping forward, Reeves shouting, and then the moment she fell. He hadn't uploaded it yet. He didn't want to cause trouble, but the image of her lying on the floor kept replaying in his mind. His older sister walked in and asked what was wrong. When he showed her the video, she pressed her hand over her mouth. "You have to share this," she whispered. "People need to see." He hesitated. "What if they come after me?" "They won't," she said softly. "The truth protects itself." That evening, he finally decided to post it online. He didn't use names, just a caption. "This happened in our town yesterday. She didn't deserve it." Within hours, people started watching. Comments flooded in, shock, anger, sadness. By midnight, the video had spread beyond their small town. Local news pages started picking it up, calling it disturbing footage of a confrontation at a convenience store. When Reeves woke up the next morning, his phone was already buzzing with messages. One from a fellow officer said, "They're talking about you online." Another said, "Stay quiet. Don't post anything." His stomach dropped as he opened the local news app. There it was, a blurry still image from the video. The headline read, "Elderly woman injured during police response." He turned off his phone and sat on the edge of his bed staring at the wall. He didn't know what scared him more, the truth getting out or what would happen if it didn't. At the hospital, a journalist showed up asking questions. The hospital staff refused to give details, but word had already spread that the woman in the video was still unconscious. The community began to gather outside the hospital, leaving flowers and candles by the front steps. People were upset, but they were peaceful. They just wanted answers. Meanwhile, in another part of the state, a man received a phone call that would change everything. He was working late in his office when his phone rang. The caller was a family friend, her voice shaking as she told him what happened. At first, he thought it must be a mistake. His mother? In the hospital? Because of a police officer? It didn't make sense. He left work immediately, driving through the night. The road felt endless, each mile heavier than the last. When he finally reached the hospital, it was early morning. The parking lot was quiet except for a few reporters standing near their vans. He ignored them and walked straight to the front desk, asking for her by name. A nurse led him to her room. When he stepped inside, the sight of his mother lying there took the air out of his lungs. Her skin looked pale under the hospital lights, and her hand was wrapped in gauze. He sat beside her, gently holding her other hand. It was warm but still. He whispered, "I'm here, Mom, you're not alone." The nurse explained that she had some head trauma but was stable. They didn't know when she would wake up. He nodded, barely hearing her. His mind was spinning. He asked quietly what had happened, and the nurse hesitated before saying, "The police brought her in. That's all we know." He sat there for hours, barely moving. Memories came flooding back. Her laughter, her patience, the way she used to read to him at night. She had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. He remembered her words. Kindness doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Later that day, one of her church friends came to visit and told him about the video. He didn't want to watch it, but he knew he had to. When he finally saw it, his hands tightened around his phone. There wasn't much to see, but it was enough. Enough to show the truth. He stood up slowly and walked out into the hallway. The weight in his chest turned into a quiet, steady determination. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply said, "This isn't going away." By evening, the video had reached major news outlets. Reporters were calling the police department nonstop. The chief gave a short statement saying they were looking into the incident, but people weren't satisfied with that anymore. Inside the station, the atmosphere had changed. Officers avoided Reeves. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with judgment. Sergeant Miller called him into the office again, his face tense. "You need to stay home for a few days," he said. "Let this die down." "It's not going to die down," Reeves said quietly. Miller frowned. "Then we handle it internally. Don't make it worse." Reeves wanted to argue, but he knew it wouldn't matter. He left the station through the side door, avoiding the reporters waiting out front. The moment he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him. For the first time in a long time, he felt small. The badge he wore, the authority he carried, it all felt hollow now. That night, the town gathered for a candlelight vigil outside the hospital. People held hands and prayed for Martha's recovery. They didn't chant or shout. They just stood in silence, their faces lit by candlelight. It was a sight both beautiful and heartbreaking. From her hospital window, a nurse watched quietly, whispering, "She'd be so moved if she could see this." The man sitting by Martha's bedside looked out the same window, his heart full of both sadness and strength. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this wasn't the end. His mother had always believed that truth finds a way to be heard, and now it was beginning to speak for her. And somewhere across town, Reeves sat alone in his living room, staring at the flickering light of his television. The news anchor was talking about the video again, about community outrage, about justice. He muted the sound and leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in his life, he wished he could turn back time, not to save his career, but to stop himself from becoming the kind of man he swore he'd never be. As the night stretched on, the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Some waited for answers, some waited for hope, and some waited for the truth to finally come out. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The morning sun poured gently through the hospital blinds, lighting up the room where Martha lay. The soft hum of the machines was steady, a faint rhythm that gave everyone hope. The flowers people had brought were lined up on the windowsill, their colors bright against the pale walls. The smell of lilies mixed with disinfectant filled the air. Her son sat quietly beside her, the same way he had for the past 2 days. He hadn't slept much. Most of the time he just watched her breathe, whispering now and then, hoping she could somehow hear his voice. He had spoken to doctors, nurses, and even the hospital director. Everyone had been kind, but their words were careful, cautious. They couldn't say when or if she would wake up. That morning, a local news van parked outside the hospital. More reporters had arrived, holding microphones and cameras. They were waiting for a statement, any small update. Inside, people came and went. Neighbors, old friends, even strangers who had seen the video online. They all wanted to show support, to say thank you to the woman who had always given so much kindness to everyone else. Her son walked out into the hallway to get some air. A reporter recognized him immediately and approached gently. "Sir, can we ask how your mother is doing?" she said. He stopped and looked at her for a moment, then shook his head. "She's resting. That's all I can say." His voice was calm, but his eyes told a different story. One filled with pain, exhaustion, and something else growing quietly inside him. Resolve. After the reporter left, he sat on a bench near the window. The town outside looked peaceful, almost too normal for what was happening. Children were riding their bikes down the street. Cars passed slowly. Life hadn't stopped, but for him, it felt like everything had changed. He opened his phone and scrolled through the messages. Dozens of people had reached out. Old classmates, church members, former colleagues, all sending prayers and encouragement. Then there were messages from strangers who had seen the video, offering support and outrage. It felt strange, how quickly the world had learned her name, how many people now cared about her story. He looked up when he heard footsteps. The town's pastor walked toward him, holding a Bible under his arm. "Son," the pastor said gently, "how's she doing today?" "Same," he answered softly. "No change." The pastor sat beside him. "She's a strong woman. God's not done with her yet." He nodded, grateful but tired. The pastor stayed silent for a moment, then said, "People are gathering again tonight. They want to hold another vigil." He looked out the window where people were already starting to arrive outside the hospital. "She wouldn't want anyone angry," he said quietly. "She'd want peace." "I know," the pastor replied. "But people are hurting too. They loved her, and they want to see something done about it." He didn't respond. His thoughts were heavy. He had always believed in fairness and truth. But this was different. This was his mother, and the system that was supposed to protect her had failed her. Later that afternoon, he received a phone call from a law firm he used to work with. They had seen the video, recognized him, and offered to help. "We'll handle everything," they said. "You just take care of her." But he wasn't the kind of man to let others speak for him. He had handled difficult cases before, but this was personal. He knew the process well. Internal reviews, reports, endless meetings where everyone spoke carefully but said little. He knew how cases like this usually ended, with apologies but no accountability. He had fought too many of those battles for other families. He had never imagined it would one day be his own. That evening, he stood outside the hospital among the crowd. The sun had set and the candles glowed softly in the dark. People sang hymns and prayed. A few speakers shared stories about Martha, how she had tutored their children, helped neighbors pay bills, or simply listened when someone needed a friend. Each story painted the same picture: a woman who gave light wherever she went. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't plan what to say. He stepped up to the small microphone someone had set up and took a deep breath. "Thank you," he began, his voice low but steady. "My mother, she's always believed in love over anger, in peace over shouting. She taught me that even when the world isn't fair, you don't stop doing what's right. So tonight I ask for one thing, not revenge, not hate, just truth." The crowd went quiet, listening closely. He continued, "We all deserve to feel safe. We all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who we are. My mother's kindness didn't deserve what happened. But I promise you, her voice will not go unheard. The people clapped softly, some wiping tears. The candles flickered in the wind. It was a simple moment, but powerful. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth carried its own strength. Meanwhile, back at the police station, the chief of police was feeling the pressure. Reporters had been calling nonstop. The mayor had demanded a full report by morning. The department's social media pages were flooded with angry comments. Every hour, the video gained more views. In his office, the chief sat with Reeves and Sergeant Miller. The air was tense. "We're opening an internal investigation," the chief said firmly. "You're both aware of what that means." Reeves nodded slowly. He looked pale, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Miller spoke up. "Chief, we've handled these before. The media's blowing it up." The chief gave him a sharp look. "This isn't like the others. She's still in the hospital, and her son's a lawyer, a well-known one. We can't hide behind paperwork this time." Reeves felt his stomach twist. He hadn't known who she was, not until that moment. "Her son's a lawyer?" he asked quietly. The chief sighed. "Not just any lawyer. He's handled civil rights cases before, big ones. If he's involved, we're in trouble." Reeves leaned back, his mind spinning. It all made sense now. The reporters, the attention, the pressure. He thought about that moment in the store, how fast it all happened. If he could go back, he would have just listened. But it was too late for that now. After the meeting, Reeves drove home in silence. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts a blur. He wasn't a bad man, or at least he hadn't thought he was. He'd joined the force to help people, to make a difference. But somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred. The uniform had become a shield, and the badge had turned into something heavier than he could carry. When he reached home, he sat on his couch in the dark. The TV was on, but he wasn't watching. He scrolled through the comments online. Some called him a monster. Others said they didn't believe the video. But the truth was somewhere in between, and he knew it. Across town, the son was meeting with a few community leaders in a small room at the back of a church. The atmosphere was calm but focused. "We're not here to start a fight," he said. "We're here to demand accountability, peacefully, respectfully, but firmly." One woman nodded. "The world's watching now," she said. "They can't sweep this under the rug," he agreed. He didn't want chaos, he wanted change. He knew how easily anger could be used against them. He wanted his mother's name to stand for something better, something lasting. The next morning, the story reached national news. Big networks were now covering it, showing the same short clip of the store again and again. They interviewed witnesses, community members, and even the pastor. Each person said the same thing. Martha was kind, gentle, and didn't deserve what happened. At the hospital, doctors said there was still no major change, but she was stable. Her son spent most of his time by her side, talking softly to her even when she couldn't respond. He told her about the people outside, about how everyone was standing up for her. "You always said love can move mountains," he whispered. "Maybe this time you'll be right again." By the end of the week, the town had changed. What had started as a quiet act of kindness had become something much larger. People who had never met Martha now spoke her name with respect. And though she still lay silent, her story had begun to speak louder than ever. For her son, it wasn't about fame or revenge. It was about dignity. He wanted the truth to come out, not to destroy anyone, but to make sure this didn't happen again. Deep down, he believed his mother would want the same. And far away, sitting in his small living room, Reeves finally picked up the phone and made a call he had been avoiding. When the line connected, his voice shook slightly as he said, "Chief, I think I need to tell the truth." There was a long pause on the other end, then a quiet reply. "You better be sure about that." Reeves closed his eyes. "I am." Outside, the night was calm again. The same stars that had shone above the hospital now hung silently over his house. Somewhere, in a hospital room filled with flowers and soft light, Martha still slept peacefully, unaware that her quiet act of kindness had set something powerful in motion, something that was about to change lives far beyond that small Georgia town. The next few days brought changes no one expected. What had started as a small-town story had now reached every corner of the country. News stations were showing Martha's picture, her gentle smile, her church hat, her kind eyes. The video had been replayed so many times that everyone seemed to know her face, even people who lived thousands of miles away. Outside the hospital, the crowd kept growing. Some came to pray, others to leave flowers or handwritten notes. There were candles burning every night, lighting the sidewalk with soft, warm light. Children from the school where she once taught drew pictures and taped them to the hospital wall. Hearts, angels, and little messages that said things like, "Get well soon, Miss Ellis," and "We love you." Inside, her son sat beside her bed as he always did. He looked tired, but his eyes were strong. Every morning he spoke to the doctors, then made a few calls, first to his legal team, then to the people organizing peaceful rallies in town. He had become the quiet center of something much bigger than himself. One afternoon, the hospital room door opened, and the town's mayor walked in. She was a polite woman, neatly dressed, carrying a folder in her hand. "I wanted to check on your mother," she said softly. He stood and shook her hand. "Thank you for coming," the mayor sighed. "The whole town's praying for her. It's brought a lot of attention. We're under pressure to act." He looked at her calmly. "Pressure's not a bad thing if it makes people do the right thing." She nodded slowly, understanding his tone. "We've started a full review of the department. The officer involved has been placed on leave pending investigation." "Paid leave?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. He didn't say anything, but his expression said enough. The mayor's voice softened. "I know how it looks, but please understand these things take time. We have to follow procedure." He looked at his mother, still sleeping peacefully, then back at the mayor. "If there's one thing my mother taught me," he said, "it's that fairness shouldn't depend on procedure. It should depend on what's right." The mayor didn't argue. She just nodded again, said a few polite words, and left the room. That evening, as the sun set, a large crowd gathered at the town square. The air was filled with soft murmurs and the glow of candles. The local pastor opened with a short prayer, then stepped aside as people took turns speaking. A mother shared how Martha had helped her son pass his exams when he was struggling. A young woman said she'd never forgotten the time Martha brought food when her family couldn't afford groceries. When her son finally stepped up to the small stage, the crowd went silent. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the faces, the candles, the hope. "My mother spent her life teaching," he began. "Not just in classrooms, but everywhere she went. She taught kindness, patience, and respect. She believed that people could change if they wanted to. She believed that peace was stronger than anger. I still believe that too. But peace doesn't mean silence." The crowd nodded, listening closely. He continued, "We've heard promises before. We've heard people say they'll look into it or make improvements. But nothing changes until someone demands that it does. So we're going to keep standing, keep praying, and keep asking, peacefully but firmly, until this stops happening." The crowd clapped, some people cheering softly. It wasn't a loud protest. It was steady like a heartbeat. Meanwhile, inside the police station, tension filled every corner. The chief had called a meeting with senior officers. "We can't hide this anymore," he said flatly. "The video's everywhere. The department's under investigation now, not just the officer. We'll have federal oversight within a week." A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Some looked defensive, others guilty. It was a small town and everyone knew each other. But now the spotlight was on them. One younger officer spoke up quietly. "Chief, people are scared to even wear the uniform right now." The chief nodded. "Then maybe it's time we earn back their trust." That night, Officer Reeves sat alone at his kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. He had been told to stay home, not to talk to anyone. His name was everywhere now. On the news, on social media, in angry signs outside the station. He'd stopped answering his phone. Even his closest friends didn't know what to say to him anymore. He picked up a pen, trying to write an apology letter, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say that would ever be enough? "I didn't mean to" sounded empty. "I'm sorry" sounded smaller than the truth. He didn't know what he was anymore. A cop, a mistake, or just a man who'd lost himself somewhere along the way. He thought about turning himself in, but part of him hoped it could still be fixed quietly. That hope faded when he saw the news later that night. The anchor said, "The family of the injured woman has retained legal representation and is calling for a full investigation into the department's handling of the case." Reeves switched off the TV. He realized this wasn't going away, and maybe it shouldn't. Back at the hospital, her son was talking to a group of journalists. He didn't sound angry, just steady. "We're not here to attack anyone," he said. "We're here to remind everyone that accountability isn't the enemy of justice. It's a part of it. My mother believed in forgiveness, but forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." His calm voice reached people. It spread online. Clips of him speaking began to circulate, just like the video of the incident. People across the country shared his words, calling him a voice of reason in a storm of noise. A week later, the Department of Justice announced it would review the case. That same day, a national news crew arrived to interview him. They set up their cameras in a small park across from the hospital. When the interviewer asked how he was staying so calm through all this, he smiled sadly. "Because she would have wanted me to. Because anger only burns, but love rebuilds." The interviewer paused, visibly moved. "And what do you hope happens next?" "I hope she wakes up," he said softly. "That's all I want right now." Inside the hospital, the nurses were rooting for her too. They'd grown attached to her. One nurse came in every morning to brush her hair and talk to her as if she were awake. "You've got the whole world praying for you, Miss Ellis," she'd whisper. "It's time to open those eyes." Days turned into weeks. The investigation deepened. Evidence was collected, reports were reviewed, and witnesses were interviewed. The clerk from the store confirmed what he saw. The young man who filmed the video came forward officially. Everything was falling into place. One afternoon, her son received a call from the state attorney's office. They wanted to meet with him to discuss the next steps. When he arrived, they told him there would likely be charges. He listened quietly, nodding, his face calm. "Thank you," he said. "That's all I needed to hear." But even with progress, the waiting was the hardest part. Every night he'd return to the hospital, sit by her bed, and talk softly about what was happening. He told her about the people outside, about the candles, about how much everyone missed her. "You started something bigger than you ever imagined," he whispered one night. "And I think you'd be proud." That same night, something changed. The nurse on duty noticed her fingers twitch. It was small, barely noticeable, but real. The monitors beeped softly as the nurse leaned closer. "Miss Ellis?" she whispered. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered slightly, then stilled again. The nurse called the doctor immediately. Within minutes, the room was full of quiet, controlled energy. They checked her vitals, spoke softly, smiled. She wasn't awake yet, but it was the first sign in weeks that she might be coming back. When her son arrived the next morning, the nurse met him at the door, smiling. "She moved," she said. "She's fighting her way back." For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to hope. He sat beside her again, took her hand, and whispered, "Keep fighting, Mom. We're all waiting for you." Outside, the town was still buzzing with reporters and cameras. The story had grown far beyond anyone's expectations. But inside that small hospital room, it wasn't about headlines or politics. It was about love, faith, and the quiet strength of a woman who had touched more lives than she ever realized. That night, as her son sat by her side, he noticed her breathing change slightly. He leaned closer, speaking softly. "It's okay, Mom, you're safe now." Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "Home?" He froze, tears filling his eyes. "You're still in the hospital, but you're going to be okay." She didn't open her eyes yet, but she squeezed his hand, weakly but unmistakably. He smiled through the tears. "You came back," he whispered, outside. The candles flickered again in the night breeze, and for the first time since that terrible day, there was light, not from cameras, not from news vans, but from hope itself. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear. Martha's story was no longer just about what had happened to her. It was about what her courage and her son's quiet strength had awakened in everyone else. A movement had begun, and it wasn't ending anytime soon. The morning sunlight spilled softly through the hospital blinds. The world outside was waking up, but inside the quiet hospital room, everything moved slower, gentler. The machines hummed, the curtains fluttered, and in the middle of it all, Martha opened her eyes fully for the first time in weeks. Her son had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand. When she squeezed his fingers lightly, his eyes opened. For a moment, he didn't believe it. Then he saw her blinking, her lips trembling as if trying to form words. He leaned closer, smiling through tears. "You're awake," he whispered. Her voice was faint, almost like a sigh. "You didn't leave me." "Never," he said softly. "Not for a second." The nurse came in and gasped, smiling widely. Within minutes, doctors filled the room, checking her vitals, gently talking to her, amazed at her progress. News of her waking spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses hugged each other in the hallway. Downstairs, people began to cheer when they heard the news. By afternoon, the story had already reached the local news again. "She's awake," one reporter said with a smile. After weeks in a coma, the woman whose story touched the nation has opened her eyes. Her son decided to keep the moment private for a while. He wanted her to heal before facing cameras or reporters. For now, it was just about peace. Each day, he read to her from her favorite book, or played her old gospel songs softly from his phone. Sometimes she would hum along, eyes half closed, her hand resting gently over his. Outside, the movement she had inspired continued to grow. People were still gathering at the town square, not just to demand change, but to celebrate her recovery and to keep her message alive. The posters that once said "Justice for Martha" now read, "Hope for All." The city's officials could no longer ignore what had happened. A public hearing was announced to address police accountability and community reform. The town's mayor, now more serious than ever, called her son personally to invite him to speak. He thought about it carefully. He didn't want to turn his mother's pain into politics, but he also knew that silence had never been his family's way. So he agreed, but only if his mother was strong enough to watch the hearing from her hospital room. On the morning of the hearing, the hospital staff helped set up a small TV at the foot of her bed. She wore a soft pink robe, her hair brushed neatly, a small blanket tucked around her legs. When her son appeared on screen, she smiled faintly. "That's my boy," she whispered. At the town hall, the air was thick with tension and hope. Reporters filled the aisles, cameras flashing. Community members lined up outside waiting to listen. When her son stood at the podium, the room fell silent. He took a slow breath and began. "This isn't about one moment or one mistake. It's about what we allow and what we ignore. It's about my mother, a woman who gave her life to kindness, to teaching others, and to believing the world could be fair." He paused, glancing at the faces around him. "My mother didn't deserve what happened to her. No one does." But her first words when she woke up weren't about anger. They were about forgiveness. She told me, "Don't hate him, baby. Just make them change." And that's what I'm here to do, to make change real. People nodded, some wiping away tears. His words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded like truth. He continued, "We can't rewrite what's been done, but we can write what comes next. We can rebuild trust. We can teach compassion where fear used to live. My mother believes in second chances, I do too. But second chances have to begin with honesty." When he stepped down, the room erupted in applause, not loud or chaotic, but deep and heartfelt. Even some officers in the back stood quietly, their expressions thoughtful. After the hearing, changes began to happen. The police department introduced new training programs focused on empathy, de-escalation, and community connection. A citizen review board was formed to ensure transparency. The town even named a small community center after Martha, a place for tutoring, counseling, and neighborhood support. The mayor personally visited her in the hospital a few weeks later. She brought flowers and a small gold plaque that read, "The Martha Ellis Center for Peace and Learning." When she showed it to her, Martha smiled faintly. "I just wanted children to feel safe," she said softly. "That's all I ever wanted." Her son stood beside her, proud but humble. "You made it happen, Mom." Over the next few months, Martha continued to recover. Her strength returned slowly, and with it came her old spark, the same gentle humor and grace she'd always carried. One day, a small group of reporters were allowed to meet her for a short interview. They expected a frail woman, but instead they found calm strength in her voice. When one of them asked what she wanted people to remember from her story, she smiled gently. "That kindness isn't weakness," she said. "And forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing to love even when you have every reason not to." Her words spread again across social media, touching millions. People quoted her in classrooms, churches, and meetings. Her story became more than a headline, it became a lesson. Months later, she finally went home. The first time she walked into her house, sunlight filled the living room. On the table were stacks of letters, hundreds of them, from strangers all over the world. Some shared their own stories, some offered prayers, and others simply said thank you. She sat down slowly, opened one letter, and smiled. "I guess people really do listen sometimes," she said softly. Her son laughed. You've been teaching them all your life, Mom. They just needed to be reminded. That evening, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. The air was warm, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant laughter of children playing nearby. She looked at him and said, "You know, I never wanted fame. I just wanted people to care about each other." He nodded. "And you made them remember how." The case against the officer eventually came to an end quietly, through the courts. He faced consequences for his actions, but Martha never spoke about him publicly. When asked about forgiveness, she always said the same thing. "I don't hold hate in my heart, but I pray that one day he understands what he took and what he gave back by mistake." Her son understood what she meant. Sometimes healing isn't about winning, it's about restoring what's been broken inside. Years later, the story of what happened in that small town became part of a documentary about community change. It wasn't sensational. It was tender and thoughtful, showing how one person's courage and compassion transformed anger into understanding. In the final scene, Martha was shown sitting at her porch, surrounded by flowers, smiling as children from the neighborhood ran past her gate. Her voice played softly in the background. "I used to tell my students that light doesn't always come from the sky. Sometimes it comes from people who refuse to let the world stay dark." When the documentary aired, people across the country were deeply moved. Messages poured in again, not just of sympathy, but of gratitude. Churches held screenings, schools used it as a lesson in empathy and courage, and communities in other cities started their own reform programs inspired by her story. Through it all, Martha stayed humble. She returned to her church sitting in her usual pew, quietly humming during the choir songs. Some Sundays the pastor would thank her from the pulpit for reminding everyone of the power of grace. She would just smile and shake her head, whispering, "It wasn't me. It was all of us." Her son continued his work in law, now focusing more on community education than court battles. He started a foundation in her name to train young people in leadership and nonviolent advocacy. Every year they hosted a gathering called The Light Within, bringing together people from different towns to share stories of healing and hope. The first time Martha attended one of those gatherings, she stood slowly at the podium, the crowd quiet around her. "I'm no hero," she said softly. "I'm just a mother who got hurt and a son who refused to let that hurt turn into hate. That's what saved us." The crowd rose to their feet in applause, not just because of her story, but because of the spirit behind it. As time went on, her health grew fragile again, but her heart remained strong. People still visited, still thanked her, still sought her advice. She always said the same thing: be kind first. Everything else comes after. When she passed away peacefully years later, the town held a candlelight service in her honor. It wasn't sad, it was beautiful. People sang, shared stories, and promised to keep her legacy alive. Her son stood quietly at the front, holding one of her favorite flowers, a white lily. He didn't make a long speech. He simply said, "My mother taught the world something simple, that one act of love can change everything." And she was right. As the candles flickered under the night sky, the crowd began to hum one of her favorite songs, soft and full of warmth. The melody carried through the air like a promise, that kindness, once planted, never really dies, and in that quiet town, under the same sun that had once witnessed pain, peace finally settled, steady, lasting, and full of light.